Hi, it's Doug. Do you recognize this? This is a view of a hurricane from space. You might know that a hurricane is a giant, swirling bunch of storm clouds. But do you realize how big it is? You see this? That's the US state of Florida right there. That's how big a hurricane is. It's a storm as big as an entire state. Hurricanes always start out as small storms over the ocean. They grow bigger and bigger, and eventually, sometimes, reach the land. That's when they're most dangerous, when they hit places along the coast, like the southeastern parts of the United States. In 2005, the US was hit by one of the worst hurricanes in its history, Hurricane Katrina. This hurricane traveled from the Atlantic Ocean, past Florida, and into the Gulf of Mexico. It reached land at New Orleans, Louisiana, and it was a disaster. Hurricane Katrina brought tons of rain. Water filled the streets, flooding nearly the entire city. Areas that used to be roads were now covered in water. Cars were ruined, houses and buildings destroyed. Many people were trapped without food to eat or clean water to drink. They had to be rescued in boats or helicopters. But where did all this water come from? I mean, we know the hurricane brought the water, but how did so much water get into the swirling hurricane clouds? Why would the clouds carry so much rain? There are two important clues to keep in mind. First of all, hurricanes start out over the ocean, all the way out here. Second, they only form during certain parts of the year, usually starting in late summer, from August to November. With those two clues in mind, what do you think? Why do you think a hurricane carries so much rain with it? Why would a hurricane have so much water? Hurricanes form over the ocean in late summer when the water is warm. Warm water evaporates more easily than cold water does to form rain clouds, just like you saw in a previous experiment. So, as a hurricane moves over the warm ocean, its rain clouds get bigger and bigger as more and more ocean water evaporates. As a hurricane hits the coast, all the water that had evaporated from the ocean falls as rain onto the land. This is why Hurricane Katrina had so much rain. It's because so much warm ocean water evaporated to form the clouds of the hurricane. This was the problem for New Orleans. When it rained so much during Hurricane Katrina, it caused terrible flooding. But the rain from a hurricane isn't the only problem. There's something else about a hurricane that causes flooding: ocean waves. Remember, hurricanes aren't just rain clouds, they're also super strong windstorms. The winds of a hurricane push on the surface of the ocean, creating waves that can come all the way up onto the shore. That causes flooding. When this happens, it's called a storm surge. Storm surge waves can be incredibly destructive. Some people who live near the ocean have to build their houses up on stilts to protect them from getting flooded in a storm surge. The stronger the winds in a hurricane, the higher the storm surge. Together, the storm surge and the rain both add water to the city, and if the water has nowhere to go, the city will flood. But here's something to note. Even though Hurricane Katrina brought a storm surge and heavy rains, not all of New Orleans flooded. Let's zoom in to the city of New Orleans to see what happened. Here's the ocean, and here's the center of the city downtown. There's a big river running through the city. And to the north of the city is a lake, Lake Pontchartrain. After Hurricane Katrina, some areas of the city were completely covered in water, most of the north and southeast parts of the city. But other parts, like the southwest, didn't have nearly as much flooding. Why might that be? The whole city got hit by the same hurricane. Why do you think some areas had worse flooding than others? Hurricane Katrina brought a storm surge and heavy rains, flooding most of the city of New Orleans and causing terrible destruction. But not all of New Orleans flooded. Why were some parts saved from the flooding? It turns out the flooding caused by hurricanes depends on more than just the amount of rain and the size of the storm surge. It also depends on the shape of the land. For example, the first places to flood during a hurricane are the places closest to the ocean. Ocean water from a storm surge can flood the land near the shore and flood buildings if they aren't raised up on stilts. Places farther from the shore aren't as likely to get flooded by the ocean's storm surge because they're higher up. We say they're higher elevation, meaning they're higher up from the surface level of the ocean. In New Orleans, all the areas close to the coast flooded. But this place marked in yellow didn't flood because it's pretty high up. It has a high elevation, and it's far from the ocean coast. But now wait, what about this place here? This part of New Orleans is on the north side of the city, far from the ocean, and yet this part flooded. Why do you think that is? Well, what else do you notice? Notice that it's next to something else. There's a lake up here and a river going through the city. Think of all the rain a hurricane drops. That rain starts to fill up lakes, rivers, and canals. And with enough rain, all of those things will overflow. That makes the areas near the lakes, rivers, and canals the next most likely places to flood, after the places on the ocean coast. So, in the case of New Orleans, the ocean storm surge came from this direction, quickly flooding all of the low areas on the coast. Then, the rain came, filling up the lakes, rivers, and canals throughout the city. Many of the canals had barriers around them, called levees, which are walls made of concrete and soil. A levee keeps water out of the city. But during Hurricane Katrina, many of the levees breached, meaning they broke open, or there was so much water that it started flowing over the top of the levees. In this picture, taken from a plane high above the city, the levee on the left side of this canal has broken. A boat actually smashed into the levee during the storm, creating a hole where water could rush out. Water then spilled into the city. In order to see where all that water went, we need to look at the shape of the land. You know that water flows from high places to low places. Places that are low elevation get more flooding because water naturally flows downhill and collects there, just like puddles forming in a low spot. Now, during Hurricane Katrina, you might expect that water would flow out of New Orleans towards the ocean, since the ocean and coastline are low elevation. But that's not what happened. Instead, water stayed in the city. That's because New Orleans is a very low elevation city. The land is actually below the level of the ocean in some places. It's hard to keep a low elevation city safe from flooding. After Hurricane Katrina, engineers had to come up with ideas for how to make sure the city wouldn't flood in the future if another hurricane hit. The first thing engineers had to figure out was how to protect the city from a storm surge. They figured out that one way to do that would be to build a seawall, a giant cement wall, along the ocean shore to block the storm surge waves. Another way to prevent storm surge would be to plant wetlands between the city and the coast. When a storm surge washes over the bushes and grasses in a swampy wetland, the waves slow down and get weaker. Another thing the engineers had to figure out was how to prevent rainwater from overflowing lakes, rivers, and canals. Engineers decided they could build stronger, higher levees to keep water from getting into the city. Finally, engineers could also elevate individual buildings, putting them up on stilts or platforms. That would keep buildings from getting flooded, even if water did get into the city. Now, suppose you were an engineer. What would you do if you were in charge of protecting a town from flooding during a hurricane? You'll get a chance to figure that out in today's activity.